Hello and welcome to Chapter 2, Part 1 of Crisis Intervention. Today we're going to review ethics, law, some legal issues, as well as other professional issues. So to begin with, we need to think about what is the purpose of ethics? What is the need for ethics? And quite simply, the populations that we tend to work with are vulnerable. They do not have advocates. They do not always know how to navigate systems. And as a result, they can be manipulated. They can be taken advantage of. So to begin with, it's to protect the client, but ethics also protects us professionally. Many of the issues that you will run into over the course of your career will have some sort of ethical underpinning or question. That's annoying. Okay, sorry about that. So, what are ethics? They are customs, they are mores, they are not laws per se. It's more like guidance about what your behavior should be in certain situations. They are general for the most part, and they are standards set forth by professionals. The one thing that you typically find across, if it's NASW or APA or NOHS, one of the things that you tend to find across those human service agencies is this idea of non-malfeasance. Non-malfeasance. That's do no harm. That's typically one of the bigger things that you'll see throughout ethical guidelines for the professional organizations. Now, what's the difference with that in law? They sometimes overlap. However, there are not legal penalties for behavior that is unethical, unless, of course, it stretches into established law. For example, and I use this in child welfare to trick people a little bit, there is a mandated reporting law which requires that a social worker or anything from a human, a counselor or a therapist, is required to report suspected abuse to authorities. And it's punishable if you don't, with fines or time in prison, things along those lines. Nice stuff. So the example I tend to use is like you're sitting in the backyard having a nice day, grilling out with your family. You look over and your neighbors next door, one of them is beating the living daylights out of their kid. All right. Are you required by mandated reporting laws to report that? No, you're not. You are not in a professional capacity with your neighbor or your neighbor's kid. Hopefully, you're not. And therefore, that does not come into play. However, ethically, I would really hope that you would find it abhorrent and need to do something about it and therefore make a call. You see where there's a discrepancy there, right? There's a difference. Entered into a professional relationship, you're ethically bound. If you're not in a professional relationship, you're not necessarily ethically bound, or a non-professional relationship, you're not legally bound, but you may be ethically bound depending on what your ethics are. Some of the controversies that fall in line in this ethics and legal discussion has to do with forcing treatment upon others. For example, requiring that people get treatment when one of our ethical guidelines is for the client to make some autonomous decisions themselves, the client's right to self-determination. Other controversies have to do with mental health laws that may have racial bias underpinning them. And really, all this has to do with is finding the best client's rights legislation. And that can also vary from state to state. The bigger thing, and I talked about this in the last chapter in terms of controversies, that bridges a little bit of ethical as well as legal stuff, I suppose, is this use of paraprofessionals. Can crisis intervention be conducted by paraprofessionals, like interns or trainees or volunteers? And that is an ongoing debate. We have done it. We are doing it. We will probably continue to do it. But it is the debate about who should be delivering services and what sort of training they have. Other issues, ethical issues, have to do with your degree of self awareness, how aware you are of what you do, those things inside of you that may cause you to make decisions that may not be in the best interest of your client, but are more about yourself. Dual relationships, not engaging in dual relationships with others, confidentiality, competence, client rights. We'll talk a little bit about virtual therapy as well as a little bit about multicultural competence. So, self awareness, to begin with, the thing that I usually talk to students about is making sure that you clean your house before you try to clean someone else's. And really, what that has to do with the biggest thing this has to do with is doing some self analysis. And what I mean by that is, I'm not talking about some big Freudian thing, but try to understand why you make the decisions that you make. Take a moment, and sometimes it's hard to do it in the moment. Maybe you have to do it afterwards or as you're thinking about what decisions you're going to make. Start thinking about why you're coming up with those decisions. How much of that has to do with what's in the client's best interest versus what you think is correct, and if that has something to do with maybe your past experiences. Um, Self awareness also keeps us from taking advantage of clients. If we are able to understand what our motivations are, we can try to separate those out from what our client needs are. And as a result, it protects the client as well as the counselor. Uh, Dual relationships can be sexual, social, financial, related to employment, and that's where basically you're providing services to someone that you're very closely connected to. You're providing counseling services, etc., to someone that you're in an intimate relationship with, that you are employed by, or there is some that you have financial transaction with that are outside of the scope of what would normally be considered a therapeutic relationship. Another example is has to do with confidentiality. It's really the bedrock of the work that we do in any sort of counseling work. It is, of course, the hallmark of trust and communication. In order for you to communicate with other professionals, there must be some sort of waiver by the client. There are circumstances in which you do not need a waiver to break confidentiality. Here are some examples. In terms of what you could do to breach confidentiality, danger to self. You have the green light to maintain the safety of one's own self. So if you're working with a client and they're talking about not just suicidal ideation, but a plan um, and the ability to carry out this plan imminently, then you will be breaking confidentiality, I hope, in order to secure the safety of this client. The other thing to think about is what we call the Tarasoff case, danger to others, duty to warn. And that is where a client makes a threat about another person, something that you could consider either a legitimate threat or a threat nonetheless, you are required not just to notify authorities, but you're required to notify the person who the threat is against. Now, you don't have to go into great detail, but you have to be specific and let them know what it is. I wouldn't go on and have a hour-long conversation with that person, but just be short and to the point. Of course, with child abuse, elder abuse, and persons with disabilities, you are required to report those, and there could be some penalty of law should you not. With regards to the Patriot Act, you must report as well if somebody's talking about terrorist activities. And if a client is suing you or a counselor in your practice, you may be able to break confidentiality through what you're going to have to testify about or any affidavits. Another ethical issue to consider is competence. How developed a professional is, how well they can do their job, how well they are prepared to do their job. And this can be based on a number of things in order to develop and maintain your competence. Using evidence-based practice, a lot of that has to do with going through the research, being aware of the research that's out there, specifically around the populations that you work with. Ongoing supervision and training, of course, continuing education, which a lot of times, if you have a license, there is a requirement every 2 years, certainly for social workers and counselors and psychologists, there are. You have to know where you're making referrals to, where you're getting them from, what they can do in terms of providing support for your client when you're making those referrals, if it's appropriate. I do recommend getting your own therapy if you have not done it. I think it's important, even if you don't have to have some hugely traumatic background to go into therapy. I think it's important if you're going to be providing these services to know what it's like to be on the other side of the desk. And aside from that, clearing up any sort of neuroses, any other things that may be going on in your life is not only going to benefit you, but will benefit you professionally and your clients as well. Also, knowing your limits. What are you good at? At what point do you need to refer clients on to people who have special expertise in certain areas? Other issues could be clients' rights, their right to consent. There are concerns that come up, of course, about risks and benefits, fees, qualifications of the counselor, as well as termination rights, termination meaning ending the counseling, and other issues that are very muddy right now because it's in development and there's a lot of stuff out there about this is the virtual or e-therapy world. And I see both positives and negatives about it, of course. And for perhaps those who really need or are unable to leave a specific area or do not have the time to but are in need of help, it makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, it really is hard to do some of the work you need to do through a virtual or e-therapy world. Not to say that it's not doable, especially for those of you who are taking online classes, you see what it's like, but there is a difference.